So thank you to everybody that's joining us for today's session in collaboration between SysGrip and Parexel. The topic of today's discussion is improving access to and experiences for transgender and non-binary patients in clinical research. So I know many of you will come from different backgrounds. Some may be from the LGBTQ+ community or allies who are interested. Some may be in the clinical research side and interested to learn. So we will start with just really level setting so that everyone has done some of the terminology, and then we'll dive into the basis of the main part of the discussion. As a reminder, there is a Q&A box at the bottom, so if there's anything that anyone wants to ask, please feel free to pop your questions in there. SysGrip are moderating for us, so they will share those questions with Liam and Sebastian and myself. The format of today's session is I'm going to share with you some learnings that we've had as we've looked at this really important and interesting topic, but I don't want to be, taking the stage too much, because we have with us the wonderful Liam and Sebastian, and I'll facilitate a discussion between them for the bulk of the session. So a bit of learning around some research and some considerations at the beginning, and then a discussion. So let's dive in. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you for joining. We appreciate you joining us, and hopefully you will learn something today. I've certainly been learning a lot over the last year or so as I've been working on this topic. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, 20 minutes of presentation followed by a question and answer session, really mainly looking at what we do and what we don't know around transgender and non-binary patient inclusivity in clinical research. There are a number of considerations which I'll go through in more detail, and then really doing a deeper dive into the available research and hearing from a patient and a physician who've been kind enough to join us today. Next slide, please. So the key things that you will learn are some of the barriers, but also some of the opportunities faced by transgender and non-binary patients in clinical research in terms of both joining and staying in a trial. Also, what can be done from a practical perspective in the clinic environment to really improve inclusivity, and then look at what we need to do together to move things forward. And we're going to do a quick polling question here, and I will leave it to Melissa to put that up on the screen for everybody. So I think you actually, for those that haven't already, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little button that says polls. So if you could just answer, we're really interested in who this particular topic has been of particular interest to that's joined us today. So if you're happy to let us know where you've come from, then that would be great, and it will really help us with directing our kind of research and discussions moving forward as well. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So to meet us, my name is Ros Round. I'm Vice President of the Patient Innovation Centre at Parexel. My role is to do so many wonderful things to improve access to and experiences for patients and caregivers in research. So that could be anything from decentralised trials where patients can participate in research from home, all the way through to looking at how we can improve diversity in research, and really reducing some of those practical and financial barriers that are often inherent when people are wanting to join research. I've been working in both patient engagement and innovation for many years now. It's an area really close to my heart. I feel very privileged to have the role that I do and work with some wonderful patients and physicians. I think, Liam, do we have you next?
I think so. Hi, everyone. I'm Liam Pascal. I am a transgender man who just actually transitioned last year, so much later in life. My pronouns are he and him. I actually work with Roz at Parexel, and I'm a global training business partner supporting one of our business units. I'm very passionate about this topic, and I've worked with Roz in some other areas as well, and looking forward to talking with all of you today and hoping that we can work towards a more inclusive environment for clinical trials.
Thanks, Liam. Sebastian?
Yes, hello, I'm Sebastian Barr. I am a counseling psychologist based out of Massachusetts in the US. And my main area of work is transgender mental health. I have a clinical practice, but I am also a researcher. I'm a consulting editor for a number of research, peer review publications, And I work as a consultant helping medical institutions and researchers improve their ability to work effectively in an affirming and accurate way with trans folks. So really excited to be on this team today.
Sorry, wonderful. Thank you both for joining us. So let me dive into sharing some of the learnings that we've had over recent months. So if you could move on for us. The first thing that I wanted to do was just orient everyone to today's discussion. Those of you that joined a couple of minutes later, just to really make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about in this discussion. So first of all, terminology, gender identity. So that's perceived or experienced gender, which may or may not match what is assigned at birth for an individual. Then we have sexual orientation, and that's more around romantic and emotional and sexual attractions to others. So I am considered heterosexual or cisgender, in that I'm attracted to members of the opposite sex, but obviously there's same-sex orientation in terms of lesbian, gay, and homosexual. Bisexual is attracted to both. Opposite sex in general is oh, hang on, we've got it right. Opposite sex is heterosexual. I've got homosexual in there. Attracted to many different gender identities is pansexual. Not experience any sexual attraction at all is asexual. And some people are unsure. It can take time, people throughout their lives. And so that's considered questioning or curious. Next slide, please. In terms of transgender, so for those of you maybe who the term transgender is newer for, it really covers all individuals whose gender identity don't align with the sex that they're given at birth. So transmasculine, transfeminine, and non-binary are the main terms that we use here. So transmasculine tends to be someone that transitions from female to male. Transfeminine is the reverse, and non-binary is either bigender or gender fluid, and there are various terms around that too. In terms of clinical research, so clinical research or clinical trials, it's all about ensuring that we have safe and effective new drugs for patients. Interestingly, when we started this discussion, Sebastian pointed this out the other day, actually we didn't find any data anywhere that actually indicated the number of trans and non-binary patients that are currently in clinical research, which I think is quite telling, and you will hear more about as we go through the research that we've done. Next slide, please. So thinking about healthcare in general, not just within clinical research, but there are many challenges that can be experienced for the trans community when accessing healthcare in general. The data I've got here is from a Stonewall report in the UK, but actually there are a number of similar reports and the data unfortunately is fairly similar. So around a third of the trans community have experienced unequal treatment from healthcare staff. And also almost half have experienced inappropriate curiosity, which I thought was horrifying, honestly, when I heard that. And over a quarter have also been outed without their consent. We spent quite a lot of time speaking with members of the trans community, and we had a patient advisory council meeting at Parexel where we invited some members of the community to come and speak to us so that we could listen and learn and work out how we can do better as an industry. And one of the things that we found there was actually everybody asked it for it to be a closed session. We normally record those sessions. They asked for it to be a closed session. It's a very sensitive topic. A lot of people may have transitioned years ago and people around them may not know that they're transgender, or they may be new in their journey and not feel comfortable telling their family and friends yet. So to have more than 1 in 4 of these patients out without their consent in the clinic situation is, just horrendous and can lead to major issues for these patients. There's also quite a lack of understanding of specific healthcare needs for this community. 62% have experienced a lack of understanding of their healthcare needs, and even some have either been refused healthcare or a huge proportion have had difficulty accessing it too. That can be for a myriad of reasons. I think some of it, as you can see in the bottom section there, is actually people avoiding treatment because of discrimination that they fear or that they've experienced in the past. During our patient advisory council session, one of our patients that we spoke with, they were in an accident and had to go to the emergency room and said that the fear of how they would be treated by the staff was greater than the fear of what was actually wrong with them physically, which was quite a shocking thing to hear. Also, we know that there are a large number of trans people who don't work. Again, some of that's around discrimination and some challenges there. So that can impact their ability to access insurance, which might be another reason for avoiding treatment. And obviously, if you don't have insurance in the US, it's very expensive to get treated outside of that. But also thinking about some of the practicalities in when you go into a clinic. 59% of trans people avoided bathrooms, and of them 8% have had a kidney or urinary tract infection as a result. It's certainly something that I, in the position that I'm in, hadn't thought about before, but actually it is a real barrier, particularly when someone's earlier in their transition, of how they will be perceived if they go into one or the other of the bathrooms. And as we talk about kind of people transitioning, again, for anyone that's here to educate themselves, becoming a trans or being a trans individual, there's a real spectrum. So for some people, it's just saying that that's how they feel. For others, they may have what's called top surgery or bottom surgery or hormone treatment or any of those different things. And for some people, they have different goals. They may want all or part of those different types of treatment, or be able to only access all or part or none of those treatments. So, so it is a real spectrum, and it does take time for the transition to occur. So I know that that is a thing that I've heard a number of times around when is the right time to stop using the one bathroom and use the other, and at what point will you pass as your confirmed gender. Next slide, please. So the main things we're going to talk about is why is trans inclusivity important in clinical research, go through these knowns and unknowns around these different areas, and then look at what we can do to really bridge the gap. And I think in terms of why trans inclusivity is important, part of it is all the things that I just said. Healthcare access can be a challenge, but clinical research, we don't want to be a challenge. Sometimes it may be someone's only treatment option, but sometimes it is a choice. And I think it's really important from an ethical perspective that clinical research is open to any and all comers. But also from a kind of scientific perspective, the idea of clinical research is to check the safety and efficacy of a medication for those patients that will ultimately take the medication. And if we don't have trans and non-binary individuals in clinical research, potentially if we're not reflecting the patient population within the study population, there can be, you know, scientific differences, or things can be missed in terms of the safety or efficacy of a drug for those individuals. So it's both an ethical piece and also a scientific piece as well. And now we're going to walk through some of these other knowns and unknowns. So what we did is we did a huge literature review of basically anything that we could find on the topic. I would say that we have definitely seen more in the last 2 years than previously. So I think this area is getting a lot more visibility. And also I think part of that is driven probably by the fact that many celebrities are coming out as trans, and I think it's making the conversation more acceptable in many Western countries, although in other countries there is a third gender and always has been, and it's not even a new thing. So it definitely varies by country. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the practical considerations, as I mentioned, sometimes it's really difficult to access healthcare due to insurance issues, fear, discrimination, really not trusting the medical profession. And we know just broadly there is a lack of trust in the pharmaceutical industry by many as well. And that lack of trust in the medical profession is often due to that discrimination and negative past experiences, but also the site infrastructure. So not every site has a gender neutral bathroom. They may not have intake forms that include the different options other than male or female. What happens if a patient is transitioning and they are being put on a ward overnight, and how do the staff handle that, and how sensitive are they? What about having that privacy around consent and those discussions, so that people aren't revealed without their knowledge to others around them? So I think the piece at site, we'll talk about more at the end, is really important. There's definitely a lot that clinics can do to make patients feel more comfortable and accepted. But also for many, particularly if they're still going through their transition, there's a lot of clinic visits, and there's a lot that people are putting their bodies through. It's a huge undertaking to transition. And we've heard that adding trial participation and all that entails on top of what they're already going through can just be too much for many patients. And it can also vary depending on what the disease is. If you've got, I don't know, mild eczema, for example, then joining a trial on top of everything else you're going through may not be a priority. But if, for example, you had cancer, then it might be a very different decision that you're making. So it's not really just one thing or the other. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the medical considerations first, so what we've heard loud and clear, that outside of specialist clinics, there is a real lack of healthcare staff training around this topic. It's not usually something that's included in medical school. It's not necessarily something that many healthcare staff encounter regularly. They may only meet a couple of trans patients in their whole career, depending on where they're based. And also in the literature review we did, what I was really wanting to get to was to understand the impact of transitioning on dosing. So we know that during transition, different things obviously happen to people's bodies. For example, one of the pieces of research we found shows that a year after transitioning from male to female, that individual still maintains around 80% of muscle mass from their original assigned gender. And so what does that mean in terms of dosing? At what point does that patient then qualify for having or should then be getting the female dosing? And so there is actually no dosing guidance, and because different people are on different medications, transitioning to different rates at different times to different levels, there is nowhere in medicine that we found that actually says this is what you need to do around dosing. And it could be that it's fine. There is some research we found that does indicate different time points by which patients could safely be treated in line with their confirmed gender, but it's more based around kind of opportunity samplings. The research is sparse. So is that sufficient guidance, or is there more research needed? There's also many complexities around transgender healthcare. And as I mentioned, gender identity is multifaceted. So it can be difficult to define within the clinical protocol in terms of the research and what that means for individuals and where they are in their journey. And from a scientific perspective, as I mentioned, there is more research. Traditionally, it used to be mainly around HIV patients for transgender and non-binary research, but we've definitely seen that evolving in the last 2 years, which is really encouraging. But there is still gaps, certainly around the longer term impact of hormone treatment. And also, if we say, okay, what we should do to make sure that we're inclusive is to include trans samples in every studies, like a group of patients in every studies that are trans, there's actually real practicalities there in terms of recruiting them, in terms of a sample size that's adequate enough for rigorous statistical analysis, but also from an ethical perspective, where there are knowns and unknowns around dosing guidance, is that even the right thing to do? So lots to consider there. Next slide, please. From a regulatory perspective, as we know, this often drives things in the industry when we're looking at change. And we did a global review of regulatory guidance. And whilst we saw a lot of guidance about inclusivity in general and the importance of having that reflection of the patient population within the study population, there was actually no specific mention that we found of transgender and non-binary patients, apart from a footnote, literally a footnote in the FDA's guidance, their 2014 report on diversity, basically that just stated that they're not addressing gender identity at that time. That may change, the world is evolving, but I thought it was quite interesting that there really wasn't anything. It is a complex area. Is it a case that it's too complex to touch? Is it that people maybe weren't aware, and maybe today's session is a really positive starting point as an industry where we can start looking at this topic more. I'm hoping that this is the start of really opening the discussion up. Then from an ethical perspective, as I mentioned before, inclusivity is really important, but safety is really important. Where there are unknowns around dosing, the whole point of the clinical trial is to determine how safe and effective the medication is. And where there are some unknowns, there are risks of overdosing or underdosing patients, which both carry risks. So we really need to think carefully about the safety and that whole piece around doing no harm. But also, I don't think it would be fair to purely say we shouldn't have trans and non-binary patients in clinical research because we just don't know enough. So there's this whole thing. And in our Patient Advisory Council meeting, we polled all of the attendees and they all said that both were absolutely equal in their minds. And so we really need to think about how we can address that. Thinking about other countries, though, actually in some countries it's illegal to be transgender. So there are legal implications if we're asking some of these questions as standard on intake forms and things in some regions. Just as in some countries it's still illegal to be gay. The other kind of unsaid piece I think that we've been pondering is that actually there will be transgender patients in research studies. We're just not proactively identifying them, or they're not self-identifying as they're joining research because it's not a question that anybody asks. Next slide, please. So how can what we know now positively impact trans access to clinical research? Now, when we were preparing for this session, I kind of finished that and said, gosh, it all sounds rather negative. I really wanted it to be a positive session around what we can do to improve trans and non-binary inclusivity, but there are these scientific and medical unknowns. So I think to some degree there is definitely more research needed where there are those areas of ambiguity, particularly on the safety side, but still there are practical steps at site where we can do things like supporting the use of gender neutral restrooms and changing those intake forms and giving them privacy. So there really is things that we can do and things that we can learn, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more in the question and answer section in a moment. But opening this conversation together today, thank you all for joining to listen and to learn, and I think starting the conversation now is really positive. Also, with the piece that we heard about a lack of trust in the medical in medicine and also in the pharmaceutical industry, I think to start building links now between us and the trans and non-binary community to really listen and learn and continue to evolve will be really important, as well as hopefully inclusion of these topics in medical school. As I say, I really think that we're starting to see a rise. I know there was a research paper last year that estimated there were around 1.2 million transgender and non-binary individuals in the US. So that's not an insignificant number of people. Liam may have different numbers. Liam's really good with the research, but that was the latest piece that I read. That is a huge number of patients to not really be acknowledging within research at the moment. So there's definitely things that we can do, but I think what I want to do is really give the time, now that I've kind of set the scene on these knowns and unknowns, is to give the time to Sebastian and Liam. So I'm going to facilitate the discussion and really give them, who are far more expert in this area than me, the opportunity to share some of their learnings and their knowledge with us. So I think the first thing is, what would you say are your top recommendations for site staff based on everything that you've seen and everything that you know? And I guess, Sebastian, being a physician, I'm sure you've got some best practices that you can share with any medical colleagues on the call today.
Well, and I'll clarify that I'm a psychologist who works within medical settings, so I don't want to claim physician status. So I'm a physician adjacent, maybe. But I'd like to have Liam start in terms of site considerations, and then I'll follow up.
So I think that I don't want to be too simplistic about it, but I think, having been experiencing a lot of this during my time transitioning, one of the big things for me is the intake form. I think I've seen 98% of intake forms just not representative of the trans community. And so it's difficult at times to get people to share, who they are in terms of their identity, their sexual orientation, when it doesn't seem like the intake forms and the questions that were being asked are inclusive of who we are. So I think that's a big one for me.
And I think one of the things that I like to stress in these conversations is really the impact of that on participants and on people seeking healthcare. I think Roz highlighted a really significant consequence, which is that people withdraw from healthcare or avoid healthcare when they know that they're not going to be affirmed and be adequately sort of seen and included. My own research has looked at the mental health implications of this, and truly the symptoms of post-traumatic stress that develop after the accumulation of experiences where people are receiving messages that they aren't who they say they are, which is what happens when they are going to fill out a form and they're forced to hit a checkbox that doesn't resonate with them, or they're put into a facility, a gendered space that isn't adequate and it doesn't match who they are. So I think there's a tendency sometimes in these conversations for people who are outside of the community to think that this is about comfort, and it's much more than that. It's quite severe. It's a real harm, and so for us, it's a potential to prevent that harm. And then also these further consequences of avoiding healthcare, avoiding participation, lack of trust in these industries where we really need the trust and buy-in. So the other thing that I would say is that in medical systems, we do a lot of gendering. So everything from records, lab results, I mean, just the way that we talk about anatomy, the way that we talk even casually about patients, there's a lot of gendering that happens. And so it's like forms are a really important starting point, but then actually integrating what people are telling you about themselves and yeah, integrating that and fitting that into how then you and your colleagues are discussing the people that you're working with is the critical next step. It can't just stop with letting people tell you who they are.
And Sebastian, I think that goes back to it's all about the lived experience of the patient, right? And when we think about, you know, health professionals and health professionals who run clinical trials, they have to have an understanding of the trans community, including, you know, simple things such as pronoun use, life experiences, health practices. All those things are a foundation for making it a more inclusive environment for all trans patients.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that we talked about as well in the Patient Advisory Council meeting was some really simple considerations that I've never kind of had to think around before. One of them being, for example, that it sounds different when you go to the restroom as a woman versus a man. And so actually creating gender neutral bathrooms is actually really, really critical and really not too challenging operationally to do, but can make a really big difference to how comfortable someone feels or their fear of being revealed, for example.
Yeah, Roz, I remember us talking about that, and I was actually sharing this morning with someone that as a transgender man going to a medical facility or anywhere actually and trying to find a restroom without fear of being bullied or harassed is almost unheard of. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Thank you both for sharing. So what would be your top recommendations for the transgender community in terms of clinical research?
Do you mean our recommendations to the trans folks directly?
Yeah, if they were thinking about joining clinical research, what would you recommend to them? What steps would they take?
So this is a great question because I think it also informs what I recommend to the people who are in charge of clinical research. I would recommend that the trans community not get involved in clinical research where there isn't an identifiable trans person involved in the team. I think it's actually, I know that sounds severe, but there's so much risk of harm that if there's not an advisory panel, if there's not a consultant involved who is helping guide the experience, I think at this stage in the industry's development, there's a lot of risk. And so that's the first thing I would say is look to see who's guiding the project and if it will be safe for your involvement.
Yeah, you know, I've thought about that too, Sebastian, and I would love for that to be the case, but I don't know that it's doable right now, I guess I should say. But I see where you're coming from. The thing I would say is that, you know, there's a lot of drugs that behave differently from one population to another, and whether it's, you know, a trans person in the medical facility or not, it's really understanding the differences at the clinical trial stage that could leave, you know, trans patients at risk of avoidable safety issue or you know, other things. And I think having the diverse and inclusive study population does help to ensure an adequate understanding of how the drugs work and how safe it is across the target population. But I go back to what you said in terms of having those strategy groups, if you will. So those groups that help clinical trial developers and staff gather, you know, community input to develop certain protocols that ultimately will ensure a safe and inclusive study for trans patients. I think that for me, that's what I look for is, you know, the ones that actually have those groups in place that actually are trying to work with health professionals who run these clinical trials to make sure they've got an understanding of the trans community as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what? Oh, I'm sorry, Roz.
No, you go ahead, Sebastian.
What Liam was saying was reminding me, and this is this is a little different than what I would say to the trans community, although also sort of keeping in mind what would be an indicator of a safe and worthwhile trial to participate in. But I was thinking about that there's not this like solid research base about, for example, when do we change dosage recommendations, but there's a huge population of clinicians who are regularly every day figuring these things out at the individual patient level. And so I'm thinking about the importance of involving people who are experts in the clinical delivery of medicine for trans people. And so even though if we are at a stage where we don't have research-based guidelines, we do have people who have been figuring this out and doing this safely at a patient care level that I think should and could be involved at the clinical trial level. And that would be a nice indicator that there's been consideration of safety in addition to the inclusion piece.
And apart from those things that you've already mentioned, are there any other recommendations that you'd have for the pharmaceutical industry as a whole?
There's a couple things, and I think I just touched on one, is these groups that actually work with communities to address participant needs and involve patients and patient advocates and caregivers in the actual design of these clinical trial protocols, and really recognizing and removing barriers to study participation. Things like accessibility, language, confidentiality concerns, making sure we're not outing people, cultural humility training for the staff, sexual orientation and gender identity, inclusive intake forms, which I mentioned earlier, and then strategies for public outreach and education, financial reimbursements for expenses, and then obviously trans-specific resources in general, I think would be a big help.
I think I will underline the cultural humility training and education at every level of staffing. There's been, I think, some important research that has shown that in different environments, I've seen it in workplace research, for example, but I think anecdotally we know it happens in clinical spaces too. Trans people can feel when they are walking into an unwelcome environment, when people are responding as though this is the first trans person they've interacted with, when a trans person is being othered in a space. And so I think that one of the ways that we address that is that we don't just have policy that is inclusive or paperwork or sort of background procedures, but that the people who are actively patient facing or participant facing are comfortable with gender diversity, because trans people will feel that comfort or that lack of comfort. The other thing I would say about to the pharmaceutical company industry at large is to not be too scared of this topic. And I think Roz, you did a really good job of talking about the complexities that this brings in, that including trans and non-binary people in clinical research involves, but also the importance of it. And I think one of the things that we can get really hung up on is like, oh, well, trans bodies are outside of the norm of how we're trained. They're outside of the norms that we've set things on. And so how do we understand this? I think there is true complexity in the diversity of different biological components that trans people bring. But what I would remind people of is that there's huge diversity in non-transgender people's bodies and biologies as well. And we don't get freaked out by that. We think about how to consider that in our research development. And so that's something I would remind people of.
And that's something we're looking at based on, so this is one of the topics that we're looking at, but we've also been looking at a lot of work around kind of race and ethnicity and inclusivity of underrepresented communities on that side of things in clinical research. And one of the things we're doing there is we're doing a protocol review session. Some of my colleagues from different underrepresented communities at work had said there are actually things built into protocols that are probably inadvertently exclusionary. So one of the examples, one of my colleagues and friends at work is Brazilian Portuguese, and he said actually there's quite a high proportion of people in his community that have a BMI over 30, but often in protocols that is the cutoff point. So he was saying it's not doing something on purpose to exclude people, but it is. And is that because that's how we've always done things, or is it because that is a medical necessity or a scientific necessity, that is a cutoff point within the protocol? And so we are going to have a session to review protocols and have a look at that and see how much is there, because it's always been, because one of the first conversations I had about this with somebody in the scientific community, and they said, well, we can't have transgender people in research because it doesn't say it in the protocol. And I was like, well, just because it never has doesn't mean that it can't. You know, things evolve and the world changes. So I think definitely that kind of review, that scientific review of what's really necessary, and that the need to enable diversity within protocols where possible, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked also about trust in healthcare, trust in the pharma industry. How do you think we can bridge that trust gap as we reach out to members of the trans and non-binary community?
Well, one of the things here that I think is also important in framing the question is understanding the way that intersecting identities and experiences also affect trust. So it is incredibly important. In fact, when Roz suggested this question, I was like, yes, we need to talk about this, because trust is a huge issue in the trans community, because there's been good historical and even current reasons for trans people to not trust the healthcare community or healthcare related research. And similarly, other marginalized groups and identities who can also be trans have other like historical and current reasons to have hesitation around trust. So I think about when we talk about what does it take to be inclusive and to build relationships with the community and to have increased trust and buy-in. We can't just be, for example, talking about trans people who look like Liam and myself. I think it's not a surprise if you go to talks like this, the most likely trans people who are involved are white guys, basically, and maybe people who are also already sort of working in similar industries. We know that the trans community is much more diverse than this, and that there's a lot more marginalization and oppression of trans women, trans people of color, trans women of color, non-binary folks. And so when we think about how do we tell the trans community that we have their best interests at heart. I mean, first of all, we make sure we have their best interests at heart, but we make sure that we have everyone's and that we're talking to everyone. So we're not just creating flyers that have, a Sebastian on them to say, hey, trans community, like, come participate. We don't just have advisors on our, community advisory boards who are parts of one part of the trans community. And that's a major one. Point of advice here is that community connection and building relationships with the community organizations and community members who can facilitate recruitment, having these advisory boards that you can point to again, not just tell people that you're trustworthy, but actually demonstrate that you are and that you've actively considered their participation. I'll pause here because I'm sure Liam has plenty to say on this as well.
No, I mean, when I think of trust, for me and the experiences that I've had over the past year and a half, it all comes down to the individuals. And what I mean by that is every single person who comes in contact with that patient has to know how to talk to that patient, has to know the right questions to ask, has to understand that, they can't react a certain way if, like Sebastian said, it's a transgender female who they feel, doesn't necessarily look the role of being a female, for example. We can do all the work that we can on getting the intake forms right and our systems correct. But if every member of a particular facility, hospital, wherever it is not trained and fully educated in how to work with trans patients, it's not going to change. And I will tell you, having walked into a medical facility, the first person that I see typically is that person who's going to take my payment, ask me what I'm there for, who I'm there to see, and ask me if anything has changed on my insurance. If they use incorrect pronouns or they don't ask me specific questions related to my identity, where I feel respected and heard and valued, I'm not going to want to see the doctor either. So it starts with as soon as you walk in.
And if I can share my experience as well, as I mentioned earlier on, this is something that I've been kind of working with the community on the last year or so. But I think anyone else who's new, the important thing is to, you may not get it right every time, but it's important to learn. So I know when we have meetings, for example, I tend to at the end say, what have I got right? What have I got wrong? What made you feel awkward, so I don't say it again. And also really important is if I do get it wrong, to not be, oh, I'm so sorry, and overdo it, because then it almost puts the onus on the other person to make me feel better for me getting it wrong. So kind of do your best, learn, educate yourself. If you get it wrong, apologize, move on, and do better next time. Exactly. Liam, would that summarize that adequately?
You're exactly right. And, I tell people all the time, it's not up to the trans community to educate everyone else. It's really up to everybody to educate themselves. And if that means, having a conversation with a trans patient and really trying to understand them as a person and, their medical needs, that's what you need to do. But it's all about respect.
And we heard as well, for anyone from a pharma company or another CRO who's interested in also speaking to members of the trans community, when we did our patient advisory council, we did hear that from the individuals that joined us that it can be exhausting because there is that burden so often to explain things to people. And also, actually, they're not always treated that well. Sometimes they're just expected to go and they aren't paid for their time, and they're not treated respectfully. So sensitivity is key, I would say. How can we bridge the knowledge gap? Oh, sorry, go on, Sebastian.
All right, sorry, Roz, I don't want to speak over you. I just wanted to emphasize something that you said, which is the payment for time when we're talking about community members. And this is actually quite an active discussion in the trans community. There's a bit of research fatigue. So even though there is not enough research, there's been a lot of social science research in the past 5 years. And so there are calls for a particular kind of research where people are, sort of sitting down and filling out a survey. And that's what people often have in their head when they think what's research. And their association to it is experiences where they're not going to be paid. Even as community advisory boards, I think that it's only recently that there's been an adoption of a model where those folks are paid for their time. And there's a bit of a feeling of being used in some way. And so payment is a very important component, and really thinking about your funding, whether that is like industry-based or grant-based, like having a piece that funds participants if possible, and certainly advisory boards. And then also making it clear what people are getting out of the study, that they are not just being used to check a box or to advance the careers or interests or curiosities of someone else.
So if you don't mind, sorry, go on, Liam.
I think oftentimes many transgender patients feel like they're, and this is horrible probably to say, but I think they feel like they're in a constant clinical trial to a degree, because there's so many things that, hormone replacement therapy, gender affirming surgeries and the like that you go through as a trans person, some trans people. And it tends to be one of those things where you feel like you're constantly going to the doctor or you're getting labs done on a regular basis. So yes, payment for clinical trials is extremely important, especially for those individuals who may not have insurance or may not have adequate insurance to pay for things like, the hormone replacement therapy, surgeries that they may need, and different types of treatment. So I totally agree with that.
So would you mind us taking a few of the questions that the audience have proposed? This is a good one. What can be used in a healthcare facility to confirm someone's identity while the person is in the process of getting the correct ID document to avoid too many questions, for example, when they're making payment?
So go ahead, Sebastian.
So I think this is going to depend on the, I think oftentimes the technology infrastructure that a clinic site has. But these days, pretty much any electronic medical records has a location for what's called preferred name often in the system, which is, where you can put the name that the person uses. Different EMRs and different adaptations or builds of EMRs are better about this. And so if you are looking to be inclusive, actually, this is something to talk to IT departments about, is making sure that the EMR or whatever, behind the scenes technology infrastructure you're using has a space to include the way that a person needs to be referred to, and that is emphasized as much or more than what's attached to documents or insurance information or IDs.
Yeah, but I would always say, in addition to the EMRs, one of the things that my doctors tend to do oftentimes is ask too. Or are you what name do you go by, or are you still referring to yourself as Liam, for example? So the EMR is great, but I think asking from time to time is also helpful.
That's a really good point, and a good reminder that these things also change. And so what might have been filled out in the initial paperwork. And one of the things to do when asking directly is to model by sharing your own information. I find this around pronouns too, that if we just ask someone what their pronouns are, they can feel like they're being othered. Whereas if I say, I'm Dr. Barr, you can call me Sebastian, and I use he, him pronouns. What would you like me to call you, and what pronouns should I use? Really easy. And then I can ask them, oh, do you want me to update that in the system also?
And something as simple as putting your pronouns beside your signature in your emails or things with communications to trans patients. It lets them know that you're a safe place, a safe person, and that they're okay to share their pronouns.
Mm-hmm. And to all patients, because we don't know who's trans and who's not, or who will come to identify that way.
Absolutely. So, loving this question from someone from a site. Is there any training we could provide to our staff to educate them on the transgender community in general? And before you answer, I should say that Liam provides amazing training for us as an organisation to help educate our colleagues. So he is actually a trainer at Parexel, but has brought amazing training on this topic. So I don't know if there are any specific resources, Liam, that you could recommend, or some specific topics that you think would be helpful.
Well, actually, the training that I delivered is not because of me, but because of the content, is a really good training. But there's also some other recommendations I would share, and I think in the interest of time, we could probably send those out to all of you. Would be best, Roz, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Are there any key highlights of topics that you think off the top of your head that should be covered, that should be, if someone maybe didn't get that email and they were thinking, how can I educate my colleagues? Like, what would be the key things that you would like to see covered?
Well, I think, and I don't want to give Sebastian time too, but I think one thing is there needs to be a really good understanding of the difference between, biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Those things are, although they're related, they're not dependent upon each other. And I think sometimes that's very difficult for some people to understand. And then, of course, using gender neutral language, using the proper pronouns, those types of things, I think, would be the foundation for any type of training that would be provided.
I really can't say more. I think that emphasizing gender diversity in this particular way, normalizing gender diversity, and the way of making a gender neutral space that thus is inclusive and affirming.
Brilliant, thank you. Along a similar line, but I think from some of my industry colleagues, a couple of people have actually asked, do we have any suggestions on any patient advocacy groups for sponsors that the pharmaceutical industry could work with to ensure inclusion of transgender participants? I know it's something that we often talk about in the patient engagement spaces, working with some of those advocacy groups to build that trust, to build that relationship. Are there any specific recommendations there?
I can see Liam sort of also like on our thinking hats. I know of local groups that serve in an advocacy function, and then I can think of like healthcare education spaces that involve a lot of trans folks like in them. So for example, the Finway Institute, which I think we have a link to in later on, the National LGBTQ IA education, healthcare education. The Finway Institute is the shorthand. But I do think that for thinking about maybe sites or even companies that are in specific regions, getting connected with regional organizations, because that's all that comes to mind in terms of patient advocacy.
So
Yeah,
maybe,
I was
more
sitting here I was racking my brain trying to think of some, but I think Fenway is definitely a good one. And I think too that there are organizations, not necessarily, medical organizations, but there are organizations in each city that I think would make great patient advocacy groups. And I think that's something, Roz, we need to do a bit more research on as well.
Okay.
And this is where I would highlight the importance of intersectionality too, because you will see that different groups, both at the national or international and the more local and regional levels, also sometimes tend to be stratified by different identities. And so you will get groups that are more inclusive or more diverse, and groups that are more identity based too. So trans people of color groups, for example. And so thinking about that when you are considering who you're reaching out to and who you're building partnerships with.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Someone's asked a question and someone else has answered it in the Q&A. So I'd love your feedback on the question and then your agreement or adjustments you would suggest to the answer. So the question is, what are some ways to encourage the trans community to, how can intake forms be updated to be inclusive and still protect the patient from the risk of being accidentally outed? Now, one of the things I know we discussed, Liam, with some of the other participants in the Patient Advisory Council was to have a protected space and ask the individual to come in to answer the forms, even if they're there with a relative, because the relative may not know. But one of the recommendations in terms of the form itself, someone said, could a potential solution be collecting all of 1, sex at birth, 2, gender identity, 3, people of childbearing potential? What do you think?
Liam, you seem to be having some thoughts, so I don't want to jump in.
I mean, I think that's close, but I wouldn't say that encompasses all. What I would suggest is that I do have a couple, I'm sure you do too, Sebastian, of intake form examples that I could share. But I think all in all, there are going to be those patients who don't want to include their gender identity or sexual orientation in the form. And it is important that medical professionals realize that sometimes it's going to be a private conversation with whatever that patient feels comfortable with sharing.
So I agree, and from a research standpoint, sometimes we have to collect that in advance or in a way where there's not an opportunity for a personal, like I'm thinking about my own research where I'm giving people surveys online.
Yeah.
And I actually will have mandated responses for some of these, and if someone doesn't want, then to answer, then that is just means that they cannot participate, and that's I see the downside of that.
Yeah.
But there are ways that we can think about how to ask these questions if there is not the opportunity to create that more, I think, safe interpersonal space to be asking. And I do think that sort of general sort of trans research consensus is that what we call the 2-step question is the most effective for serving our research needs of being able to categorize people, which is an imperfect thing, but sometimes we need. So that's the asking for gender and then asking for sex assigned at birth. I always encourage people to ask gender first from an affirmation standpoint that tells people that that's what you're seeing them as, and that also there's this other important information that you need. I think depending on the kinds of, this is where we have to be really thoughtful about what kind of trials we're doing or what sort of services we're offering and what information we need. Sometimes that's all that's needed. But I like if you are concerned about what kind of anatomy or hormone levels people are on or people have, finding ways of asking specific questions related to that and explaining why. Now, this is like I'm very much thinking about clinical research here and not general healthcare. But there is some, I think, value in doing things like we call them what do we call them? Oh, anatomy inventories, and sort of saying, okay, which of these are relevant to your healthcare? Like, which of these do you have? And that's relevant if you have something where you need to know if someone has a uterus or has ovaries or has, testes or etc. And so I think, but that's a really sensitive, difficult question for some people and could be triggering or could feel gross. And so I think you have to be really thoughtful about when you employ that. Is that in the first page? Is that, later on? Is that actually a second step in the research process? There are lots of different ways of doing it. But the sort of shortest, most sort of basic, if you're going to do a general intake across the board, that two-step, what's your gender identity and what sex were you assigned at birth, gives us the most basic sort of way of categorizing people.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got 5 minutes left, during which I'm going to ask you, first of all, if there's anything you'd like to share with the audience today that we haven't yet discussed. Then we are going to put up on the screen where people can go for further information and support. And we also have a polling question. So lots to do in 5 minutes. We knew it would be a full discussion today. So maybe, Joan, if you could put the polling question up for people, if you want to click at the bottom to answer the polling question, and maybe you could put the slide up with the additional resources at the same time, and we'll give everyone a minute for that. Someone's asked if the slides are available. Absolutely happy to make these available. It's so important for us to educate and share and build and grow on this. So delighted for people to have the slides for this. So anyone happy to answer the poll, please do. Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, if you can put it onto that slide, Joan, for the towards the end with the resources, both from CISGRIP and in terms of that's the one. Wonderful. I'll give everyone just a minute to do that. And then I guess Sebastian and Liam, in our last 4 minutes together, is there anything that we haven't touched on today that you would like to share with the audience?
Liam, do you want to start?
Well, I feel like we've touched on so much that we've sort of encompassed everything, but I'm sure we could spend another 2 hours if we had it. I would just say, when we're thinking of clinical trials, there's just some key things to keep in mind. Just adopting enrollment and different ways of going about including the trans patients, working with communities to address their needs and involve patient advocates and patient advocacy groups. Considering exactly what the study is intended to show and how that study is going to be designed to ensure that target population is adequately assessed. And then, of course, removing those barriers to the study participation for the trans and non-binary community.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Sebastian?
I think we've covered so much, and I feel like this has been actually a really lovely example of the importance of including, frankly, of including trans voices and also including people who are experts in this work. That you saw how much ground we were able to cover with an expert literature review and just a 30-minute discussion. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think the thing that we haven't gotten to talk as much about, actually I lost it. Oh no.
I'm sure it's wonderful, whatever it was, Sebastian.
It happens, Sebastian.
You can always share it with people.
The point is that I think we've actually covered so much, and that each of the areas that we hit on has some specific points that, of course, are more nuanced than what we were able to get to. But that's why there's going to be opportunity for more learning, and hopefully this has just sparked people's interest and awareness.
Well, we've already got someone in the chat saying that they're ready to take action. So I'll go on, Sebastian, in our last minute.
I was going to say, I remembered the thing I wanted to say was that I think we talked very vaguely about the consequences of not understanding what having protocols and having the trans people included in research. And I just want to say, like, it's very hard to be a trans person and to go into something and not know what is my risk level. Like, here I'm reading this pamphlet, it says the risk level for females of having this side effect is this. What does that mean? Females based on sex assigned at birth, based on organs, based on hormones, etc. And so that even that patient making, patient-centered decision making is really affected by not having this research. So I'm so glad people are moving forward with this. It's so important.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, you are both amazing, Sebastian and Liam. I appreciate your time, your expertise, your openness with everybody, and I hope that people have enjoyed the session. We will make the slides available. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.